Welcome to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation's Georgia Legends. Hello, I'm Bill Shipp, and joining me today are three of Georgia's political legends: former Governor Ernest Vandiver, former Governor Carl Sanders, and former Lieutenant Governor and Speaker of the Georgia House, George T. Smith. These political contemporaries are here today to discuss the personalities, the events, and the historical context of Georgia in the early 1960s, a pivotal era in our state's history, in which the decisions made by these men and their colleagues shaped the destinies of our state and nation today. Governor Ernest Vandiver ran for governor in 1958 in a time when the racial issue was burning red hot in Georgia politics and in Southern politics. At that time, the Brown versus Board of Education had been decided in 1954, and it appeared that school desegregation, it appeared to some at least, was inevitable. Governor Vandiver, I think when many people write about that era, journalists and historians, they look back and they always remember your speech, which has become known accurately and not accurately through the ages as the No Not One speech, in which you pledged that no schools would ever be segregated. Talk a little about the times, the atmosphere, and what motivated that.
Well, nobody could have been elected governor or any other public office at that time, including Carl, when he ran, if he were opposed to integration. And at that time, I ran and, as I said previously, had 4 planks on my platform, and one was to preserve segregation in public schools, and then the other 3 that I mentioned later. Again, Roy Harris and Marvin Griffin enter into this picture. They had gone out to Arkansas and talked with Governor Forbes about the statutes that we had enacted in Georgia. And they asked Governor Forbes to enact the same statutes in Arkansas that we had enacted in Georgia. Well, at the time I was elected, those statutes were still in effect, and I thought that maybe I would be able to get through my 4 years without having to deal with this problem. 3 weeks after I was nominated, which at that time was tantamount to election, the court ruled in the Arkansas case and knocked out all of the statutes that had been enacted by the legislature in Arkansas. So I knew then that things were going to be tough. I didn't know whether it would hit in my administration or not. Judge Frank Hooper ruled in a case in Atlanta that the schools had to be integrated. He was very generous and certainly understanding in that he gave us 1 year before we had to take any action. And Carl and Griffin Bell and George and a lot of us got together and discussed what we ought to do. Griffin Bell came up with the proposition that we ought to create a commission. And of course, I didn't know what a commission would do. I had no idea what a commission would do. But he mentioned Judge Sibley as potential chairman of that committee. And I knew Judge Sibley to be one of the great people in Georgia, one of the most honorable people in Georgia. And I made a trip over to King and Spalding and talked with Judge Sibley and asked him if we put in the resolution that he would be chairman of that committee if he would serve. Well, Judge Sibley was in his 70s then. He didn't like the idea of getting back into active politics. At first, he was hesitant. But I asked Judge Sibley to do it for the state of Georgia, that I thought he was a man that could do it better than anybody else. And he agreed to serve as chairman of that commission. And then the legislature created what has since been known as the Sibley Commission. And I think, George, you served on that,
No, I didn't serve on
I
the
didn't know
commission.
whether you served on it or not. But anyway, we had a great commission. We had all of the educators. We had the good businessmen. We had newspaper editors. We had some of the members of the House and Senate who served on that commission. And they went into every county or every district in Georgia and posed the question to the people in that area. Do you want schools or no schools? That was the issue. And he gave everybody a chance to sound off. The segregationists, of course, let all their neighbors know that they were still for segregation. The integrationists, and they were not large in number, but there were a few, had made their position clear. And that commission came back to the legislature with a recommendation, and it was split. I think there's only one vote difference in that commission. Part of them said that schools ought to be closed, and the other group said that they ought to be kept open. Well, at that time, I called all of my department heads and all of my closest political friends to a meeting in the executive mansion. And Carl, at that time, was serving as, I believe, President Pro Tem of the Senate. And I had Jim Gillis, I had Dixon Oxford, I had everybody that had really supported me. And I asked them this question. I said, we've got a situation now where the judge has ruled that these two students must be admitted to the University of Georgia. By the way, Gene Cook was Attorney General, and I sent Gene down to appear before Judge Boodle, and the decision had already been made, and I sent him to Atlanta to appear before the judge in Atlanta, and the decision had already been made, and I sent him to Washington to the Supreme Court, and the decision was made before he could. That was the fastest case that it was ever gone from the district court to the Supreme Court. But anyway, the executive mansion, we had a big sunroom out there, and we could all sit there. And I went around the room. There were some 50 people there. And I asked each individual, I said, do you think the schools ought to be closed, the university ought to be closed, or should it be kept open? And as I went around the room, there were two people that said that the schools should be kept open. One of them was Frank Twitty, who was my floor leader, and the other one was Carl Sanders, who had been my majority leader in the Senate and also President Pro Tem. All of the others said the schools ought to be closed. Well, the decision was mine to make, and I had to make a decision. I couldn't conceive of the fact that we'd have thousands, a million children on the streets with the schools closed, with the University of Georgia closed, and with our educational system just out of existence. And I'll have to say that Betty and I spent a lot of time on our knees seeking divine help in trying to make that decision. And in view of the fact that most of my friends were opposed to what I finally decided, we did make a decision and went before the legislature in the first night meeting of the legislature. We'd never had one at night. I wanted to have it at night so we could talk to the parents of the children all over the state. And we made proposals that the schools would be kept open. We also made a proposal that we would have tuition grants for those who did not want to go to those schools. And the whole legislation that we proposed to the legislature passed with only 17 votes opposed to our proposal.
Did you catch a lot of flack from out in the state?
Oh, yes.
People that said you reversed yourself.
Letters, phone calls, people that had supported me and had contributed to my campaign. I caught hell, really. But I had a lot of friends that stuck with me.
In retrospect, and looking back to that 58 campaign, do you believe that you overestimated the strength of your challenger, who was a arch segregationist, William Bodenhammer, that you might not have been so strident had you known he was so weak?
Bill, that's absolutely correct. Somebody some editor put a headline in the paper in DeKalb County, Vandiver, middle of the road on segregation. Well, you couldn't be middle of the road at that time. You had to be for segregation. So Bodenhammer, who was my opponent, used that middle of the road all the way during the campaign. And we got together with our friends and decided what we ought to do. And we made statements that we later regretted, wish we hadn't made, wouldn't have had to made. We could have been elected without that.
Of course, hindsight's 100%.
Hindsight's 100%.
But when you ran, Carl, in '62, the era of segregation was not quite over. You couldn't quite play the racial card, but you still could not be liberal on racial matters. This quote is attributed to you. You said once, "I am still a segregationist, but I'm not a damn fool."
That's right.
Is that accurate?
That's accurate. My passion in politics was public education. I was a product of the public schools. I grew up in Augusta, went through the public schools. I went to the University of Georgia on an athletic scholarship. I knew that there was no way in the world that we could afford to shut down the public education system of our state. And Ernest's right. I remember that meeting just like it was yesterday, and I commend him for doing what he did, although I know it took a lot of courage to try and go against the old political allies and some of the people that were his supporters. I was in a different situation. I grew up not as a product of a Talmadge machine or an Arnold machine or anything like that. I came back after the war. I ran as a part of an independent party. I got elected to the General Assembly without having all of those old ties and old supporters. And so I went around the state with Frank Twitty on this Chamber of Commerce tour that's still going on in the state today back in '62. And at that point, the two major candidates were Marvin Griffin and Garland Byrd. And as we toured the state, and I give Frank Twitty a lot of credit because he was as strong a segregationist as I think ever came down the pike. But as we went around the state, I took the position that we had to keep the public schools open at all costs. Twitty didn't start off in that position, but by the time we finished the tour of the state, Frank Twitty finally said, "You know, you're right. We've got to keep the public schools open." We went into that meeting with Ernie, and he had all these people in there who were telling him that it was absolutely political suicide to take any kind of position other than creating private schools and having no integration. I knew, as well as I think he knew, that if we did that, we'd have a generation of illiterates, and we were not going to have that. I had to run after he decided to go ahead and admit Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes to the University of Georgia. I had to go out there and campaign against Marvin Griffin, and his whole campaign was a racial issue. I mean, he took me to the woodshed, so to speak, every day on the basis that I supported the blacks and that he, of course, was opposed to them. Back in that day and time, and I use the expression not because it's something that I'm proud of, but something that they used, back in that day and time, I was, quote unquote, the nigger lover in the campaign, and he was not. And I had to go through that whole process, and eventually, of course, the people of Georgia realized that we couldn't shut down the public schools, and they voted for me in preference to the group that wanted to shut the schools down. But that was a very volatile time in the history of the state. I think if I had lost that election and Griffin had won, I don't know what would have happened to our educational system. But that's what I was. I was not out there. I was not out there trying to promote integration. I was out there trying to protect public education.
George T., you were practicing law in South Georgia at that time, and in the legislature, there is some feeling from my time anyway, that when it came down to it, that leaders of the community, most of whom had gone to the University of Georgia and they wanted their children to go to the University of Georgia, could not tolerate the thought that the university would be closed. Do you think that's an accurate perception?
Yes, but here's the thing about it, Bill. They would not make that statement public. they'd come to me and said, "Now, we can't close the university, we can't close school." But they didn't support me in that publicly. They'd take a different stance out public at that time. But I agreed with them that we had to keep schools open.
Let me tell you a little story that George and Carl both know. Roy McCracken, who was the law partner of
Roy Harris.
Roy Harris.
Yeah.
Roy came
we better identify Roy. Roy Harris was the Speaker of the House, Board of Regents, a real political shaker and mover.
He
Head
was
of the
in
Cracker
this era.
Party at one time in Augusta.
Right.
Roy McCracken came in after that legislation had passed and the two black students had been admitted and said, "I've got a daughter who lives in the dormitory where Charlene Hunter has been assigned, and I'm going over there and take her out of school." That was on Friday. He came back over the weekend. He came in my office Monday, and I said, "Roy, did you take your daughter out of school?" He said, "No, she wouldn't go." He said, "I tried to, but she said that didn't bother her at all, that she was going to remain in school no matter what I said."
Higher
Let me
education.
tell you one other little point of that particular thing that people probably don't realize how close we came to a total violent situation. The national media was very much attuned to what was happening at the University of Georgia and what was happening in this racial thing. They came down with their television cameras, and at that point, because Ernie had made the speech and said we were going to admit them, they came down with the idea that they were going to see some real head knocking over at the University of Georgia between the students. That didn't happen. So what they did, they paid students, some of them $10 a piece, to take a piece of rope and run in front of a camera. And this was CBS or NBC or one of them, and dangle that rope as if they were going to lynch somebody for integrating that university over there.
That's absolutely true, and it was CBS.
Okay. That's the kind of climate that we were all trying to operate in as responsible politicians.
I think it's kind of interesting in this state that higher education has always been a part of the flashpoint of political controversy, going back into the 1940s, again in the integration of the university. When Dean Rush showed up, your platform was improving higher education. But it seems to me one of the great crises occurred early on in the 40s at the outset of the Arnold administration. The University of Georgia, in a similar situation, was taken off the accreditation list. Tell us a little about that.
Yes, that's true. Dean Cocking was head of the education school at the University of Georgia and had received some of the Rosenwald funds, I believe. And Rosenwald was a very liberal individual, and Gene Talmadge felt like that if he accepted funds from Rosenwald, that he ought to be kicked out of his position as head of the education school at the University of Georgia. And he did make an issue of it. But what I know now and what I learned later, I was talking with Roy Harris about it. He and Ellis Arnold had a very close relationship with the Accreditation Commission. They knew that if they could get to the University of Georgia unaccredited, that would be an issue that they could beat Gene Talmadge with. And Roy told me personally, and there were 2 or 3 other people around, that he and Ellis Arnold asked the Accreditation Committee to take the University of Georgia off the accredited list.
And it worked, and Ellis Arnold
did, and Ellis Arnold was elected.
Now, let's fast forward to the Dean Russ problem, which came at the end of the Vietnam War. Russ left government, went to work for the Rockefeller Foundation, thought he was going to land in an Ivy League school, did not, because the Vietnam War had been so unpopular. So he turned to come to the University of Georgia, and that touched off another firestorm of controversy.
It surely did. Carl and I were the only 2 public office holders, I think Ben Fortune did, only 2 public office holders that publicly endorsed the idea and thought it was a great idea. And Carl and I had to run against that in 1970 when we both ran. We were dubbed again, that word that he used a moment ago, as lovers and what they were going to do to us. And I ran into that all over this state, that if I was going to support a fellow like Dean Russ from the University of Georgia Law School, they were not going to support me for public office. And Carl ran against that same thing. Now that's how deep it was in 1970. It was deep in 1970. It was deep in 1966, because in 65, whenever the reapportionment legislature, and you know that's when the blacks came to the legislature so much, I had to get permission from some of the white legislators to see black side of them, even in front of them or behind them. And that's how deep it was in 1966.
Let's talk a little about reapportionment. Carl, you went through how many reapportionment, and you came out of the end of the county union system when everything was in total turmoil.
Well, I went through 3 of them, and I'll say this to Ernie. Ernie, of course, was on his way out when I got elected in September of '62, and it was tantamount to me becoming governor. Ernie said to me, once the court said you got
winning the Democratic nomination.
The court said
that was the game.
Right. The court said you've got to reapportion the state senate. So Ernie said, okay, you are the governor-elect, and it's going to be your responsibility in the future to run this state for the next 4 years. You are now the president pro tem of the Senate, so I'm going to let you reapportion the state senate.
I'd had enough problems already.
And George L. Smith was Speaker of the House, Governor, and he came to me and he said, since Carl has elected you the Speaker, by golly, you'll take the responsibility in the House.
Yeah, that was the second go-around.
Yeah.
But the first go-around, and I want to say this to show you a little bit about the character of the kind of people that was in the General Assembly of Georgia at that time. Now, back in those days, as Ernie said, you rotated senators out of their district depending on every year except for Fulton County. And there's only one instance where they didn't do that, and that's probably one of the reasons I got a chance to run for governor, was that 2 other counties, I represented Richmond, Jefferson, and Glasscock, and 2 other counties, Jefferson and Glasscock, waived their right to name a senator and allowed me to serve 3 terms, and otherwise I never would have been in the Senate at the time that I got an opportunity to run for governor. So that was something that happened to me that probably had as much to do with me being able to run for governor.
You asked me to call the chairman of the Democratic Party in Glasscock County, which I did.
E. Griffin, who was a friend of his and a friend of mine, and he agreed that he would support it, and of course they waived their right. But anyway, when we got down to reapportioning the Senate, we had some of the finest people in the state representing their districts in the Georgia Senate. Best business people, professional people, lawyers, doctors, they were all in there, and they were excellent public servants. They knew that when we finally got a plan together to reapportion the state Senate, that many of them were going to vote themselves out of office and that they were not going to be able to return. And they stood up when I told them, look, we either do it ourselves or the federal court is going to do it for us, and I think we'd be better off if we reapportioned ourselves and allow the federal courts to do it, which they were doing in Alabama and other places. I saw men stand up, and there weren't any women at that time in the Senate. I saw men stand up and cast their vote to eliminate themselves as a public office holder. I thought that was really an act of political courage, and that was the first session. Then when I got into the office of governor, then we had to reapportion the congressional districts. That was that famous or infamous session where Denmark Groover tore the clock off the wall and crashed it to the floor. And we had my floor leader, George T. was the speaker. My floor leader was Arthur Bolton from Griffin. He quit in the middle of the reapportionment because Jack Flint was sitting in the Henry Grady Hotel, who was his congressman, and we were having to divide his district up. Tick Forrester was a congressman down in the 2nd district. Peter Zach Gear was protecting him. He wasn't even going to run again, but he wouldn't tell us that. Mr. Carl Vinson was, of course, holding down his district in Middle Georgia. He also was not going to run again, but he didn't tell us that, so we were up there fighting, trying to get the congressional districts reapportioned. And of course, it was one of those nights People don't like to hear this, but I'll tell you right now, you've heard that old saying, the two things you should never watch being made, one is laws and the other is sausage. Well, that night we made a law that I'm telling you how it happened. We finally got the bill passed in the early hours of the morning after we had stopped the clock a few minutes before 12 o'clock. We passed a map. We didn't even have a bill. And between 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock the next morning when the clerk's office opened, we drew a bill to conform to the map. That's how we reapportioned the congressional districts in Georgia, or otherwise we would never have been able to do it.
Now, let's get the straight of the Denmark Gruber episode. He was trying to start the clock. He was not trying to stop it.
Trying to restart it.
Trying to restart it,
yeah, because
so the session would run out.
the session time would run out, and he figured if he could restart the clock, he had it past 12 o'clock, he'd have something to go on. But it's too, when he reached over there to get the clock, he was trying to restart. He was still hanging on the wall. And he reached down and he didn't get a firm grasp on it, and it fell to the floor. When it fell to the floor, Odom from Albany, Husky Odom from Albany jumped up and down on the clock and tore it up where it wouldn't run anymore. Which was now he didn't do that intentionally, because he was with Gruber. But when he broke the clock, he wouldn't run anymore, so somebody keep asking me, he says, "What's the time of the clock, Mr. Speaker?" I said, "The line on the floor, we're going by that one." It was broken, he wouldn't move. So we went to 3 o'clock in the morning with 11:30 clock lying on the floor. Nobody ever picked it up. I said, "Leave it right there, don't bother."
Let me ask all of you, you see what's happening in reapportionment now as a fruit basket turnover. The courts have stepped in once again, thrown out the reapportionment plan. Are we seeing history replay itself?
It's amazing the way that the Republican Department of Justice mandated that Georgia change the apportionment, and of course it was wrong, and the Supreme Court has now handed down a decision which I hope will make it more equitable.
Do you see incumbents scrambling once again to save their own seats?
I don't think you can. I've been reading the paper here recently, and people are saying, well, we'll just make a little adjustment here and a little adjustment there, and that's all we'll do. I don't think you can reapportion the congressional districts of this state. You can't reapportion one without impacting all the other 10. And before it's over, we're going to have a whole apple basket turnover of people trying to rearrange these districts. Now, if it comes out otherwise, I'm going to be greatly surprised. But my experience has been that when one district is agreed upon, there are 10 others, now that we've got 11, that they say, well, that may be agreed upon, but that doesn't include my district. I want to have something to say about my district, and it affects all of them.
As a former presiding justice of the state Supreme Court, were you surprised the Supreme Court tossed this out, stepped right in the middle of an election?
No, I wasn't, because they'd been leaning in that direction. Other opinions that they'd been writing had been going in that direction all along. And I think it's instant the Republican Justice Department decreed it to be done this way, but it was Republicans appointed by Republicans on the Supreme Court that undecreed it. I think that's right instant.
That's correct.
That one against the other.
Do any of you have the sense that we're going back to a time where perhaps race relations are not as virulent as they were in the 50s and early 60s, but that they are more strained, and how about that?
I think that we still have a problem. It is not quite as strong as it was in the 50s and the 60s. But we still have a racial problem in Georgia, and no question about it.
I agree with that.
I agree with it, too. And one of the main reasons is because the black office holders, they are using race to stay elected, just like the whites did to stay elected back in the 50s. You watch it. They're the ones that talk about racism all the time. Now, every time somebody disagrees with them, it's racism.
And yet that congressional redistricting map that was thrown out, had that been offered in the 60s, it would have been assumed that that was a creation of the White Citizens Council.
Totally unacceptable.
Yes.
I mean, we had a tolerance factor of about 10 to 15% population-wise, and now we've got, what, 7.5 million people living in Georgia, something like that, and you're going to have to, at least you're going to have to try to put 700,000 people, close to that, in each one of these districts before you start trying to create these black and white districts, and I don't know how they're going to do that.
Walking out of the history books and into the lives of those who made history, Georgia Legends brings to life the persons and events who helped shape our great state. We wish to thank former Governor Ernest Vandiver, former Governor Carl Sanders, and former Lieutenant Governor and Speaker of the Georgia House, George T. Smith, for being here today. From those who led our state through tough and challenging times to those who desire to know more about our state's rich and colorful history, we thank you for joining us.